This is a great time of change in the technology industry, and we see a number of trends that have really caused people to treat information and the way they manage it pretty differently. First of all, let me talk about a couple of high-level trends, if you will. So, of course, we see the world moving to a focus on data. And this idea of digitalization, sort of seizing these business moments, if you will, and looking at how to leverage information to grow your business is something that is more important than it's ever been. We talk about actually a number of different eras within IT, and we would say probably right now we're between the second era and the third era, if you will. The first era sort of being way back as computers were first invented. The second era being the era of industrialization. And that era really was comprised of a focus on process and technology, ITIL, best practices, service level agreements, and really hardening IT infrastructures. We're really moving now into this third area, again, where we focus on digitalization. And this really requires agility, using information kind of at the speed of light almost, if you will. Growing your business by analysis of big data, things of that nature. So we see a lot of organizations that are sort of stuck between industrialization and digitalization. Now, neither one of these is bad and neither one of these is good. You really do need the capabilities of both eras, if you will. So operating in kind of this bimodal way. But it does mean that we have to pay more attention to the way that we do things like, for example, information governance. We also see trends associated with cloud. Of course, everybody knows about cloud. Cloud is here in a big way. And in fact, some of the surveys that Gartner does show that organizations believe that about 50% of their data will be resident in the cloud, external to the data center, within the next 3 or 4 years. We also look at mobile as a very distinct and interesting trend, of course, one that everybody is familiar with. However, from a governance perspective, from an information perspective, end users really want access to their data all the time, from anywhere, from any place, at any time, and it's just an expectation. There's no sort of negotiating with IT over this, it's just an expectation. And of course, some data, some critical data, mission critical data often will be resident on these mobile devices as well. So the trend is, how do you protect that? How do you govern that information? And then finally, just one other that I'll mention is this whole idea of social media and using the information that is available through social media sites for growing your business, for increasing your customer loyalty, doing all sorts of analysis, and really figuring out how to bring that social media, that social world into your business is a trend that's very important. There's certainly a number of challenges that organizations face when they try to govern their information, their data. And unfortunately, sometimes they're difficult to overcome, but oftentimes there are ways to address them. But let's start by talking about some of them. So first of all, I'm going to mention the fact that oftentimes organizations find that their business units are actually going outside of IT to procure some kind of application or to leverage some kind of data. And in fact, again, some of our surveys show that up to and maybe even more than 25% of technology is resident external to IT. So this presents challenges with respect to information. How can the organization govern that data if there's no central control point for it, or if they don't necessarily know where it is, or which business units are pushing their data external to the data center? That sort of leads into the next challenge. That's identifying the sources of the data. So if you're trying to, for example, procure data or collect data for a discovery event, if you've been litigated or something of that nature, you need to make sure that you understand where those data sources are And oftentimes, in a non-well-governed environment, it's very difficult to identify those data sources. Sort of beyond the need to collect and understand where these data sources are, organizations also want to leverage the data that they have. They have access to this stuff, they've been able to collect more of it, there's new content types, and they want to perform analytics on it, use it for reporting. And then, of course, they need to protect it as well. It's very important for them to make sure that they have access to it and that it doesn't disappear. So all of this needs to be done, of course, at a cost that's acceptable. So it can be very expensive to manage this stuff. You've got to sort of weigh the risk associated with not knowing where your data is versus the cost of understanding or being able to protect it and access it and govern it. So the bottom line is we really think that companies want to be more proactive and manage this data better. They want to proactively govern their information. But the challenge is, where do you get started? How do you attack this? And how do you do it in a comprehensive way? So a few key components of a successful information governance strategy would consist of the following. I would say, number one, you really want to manage your information as an asset. As we talked about in the beginning, digitalization, this whole digital world that we live in, means that apart from the people in your organization, information may be one of the most critical things that you have, the corporate jewels, if you will. You want to understand what information you want to share and manage that accordingly, make it available with access rights and all of those types of things. But you may also want some exclusivity with your information. You may want to keep it close to the vest and not let your competitors or your clients or somebody know some of the things you have because it does make you competitive. So understanding how information is an asset and managing it accordingly is a key component. I would also say that you want to, again, work with the team that I described, the legal people, the compliance folks, IT, some of the businesses, but don't overgovern. Don't make the policies you put in place so onerous that nobody wants to comply. You know, we talk about a big bucket strategy, if you will. I've seen organizations that try to put in place many, many, many categories and try to categorize things according to keywords and all sorts of stuff like that. But the organizations who look at this with sort of that big bucket approach, if you will, with just a few categories, tend to show more success and be a little bit more successful. I mentioned the tools to complement, you know, things like archiving tools, backup technologies, records management components, copy data management technologies. Endpoint capture is very, very important. File sync and share, all of these different things can support and underlie an information governance strategy and make it easier to implement, easier to manage, and easier to support. And ultimately, being proactive, putting this stuff in place ahead of time, making it easy for users, compliance officers, litigators, IT, to find the data that they need, to manage it in a way that makes sense, so that there's not scrambling at the end when they need it, is a very key component to make information governance work. There are a number of risks to companies that don't address the challenges of good information governance in the right way. First of all, of course, the one that probably comes to mind immediately is the risks associated with litigation, with non-compliance, and of course the risks there are fines, penalties, but beyond that, loss of brand, loss of revenue associated with litigation, things of that nature, and perhaps even closing the doors of your company. Severe penalties can be levied against organizations that don't comply and that don't have the ability to produce data as necessary, so kind of risk number one, if you will. But beyond that, we also see some risk associated with, for example, a lack of competitiveness. If you don't have the ability to find the data that you need, use the data that you have, your competitors might have that. They have a better information governance strategy, they're quicker, they're more agile, and they can get to the customer or whoever your end user is much more quickly. So agility may be compromised, that competitiveness may be compromised, and so really that's kind of the non-punitive aspects, but just as important. And then also, you may be stuck in this kind of bimodal dysfunction that we talked about really at the beginning of our session, where you're stuck in IT industrialization, you want to move into some new areas, you want to begin to leverage the data that you have, whether it's social data, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's on endpoints, whether it's via a mobile device, and you really can't get there because you're stuck. You're still dealing with old systems and you haven't governed the data, you haven't made it available in a way that makes sense. So lots of risk in not being able to move ahead. So bottom line is information governance, great practice, great thing to do. It can be done cost effectively, it should be done proactively, and if organizations take the necessary steps to put a good information governance program in place, we see a lot more happy IT organizations.
Druva offers endpoint data protection and governance solutions for the modern enterprise, specifically solving the needs of today's workforce that's increasingly mobile, who is using a lot more corporate endpoints than ever before, accessing data across unpredictable networks, an increasingly global workforce spread across multiple sites and corporate locations, and increasingly social in their behavior, looking to share a lot more content than ever before with their peers and colleagues. So we offer protection against data loss with the industry's best backup solution, protection against data breach with a DLP solution. And we offer governance of corporate data on endpoints, offering IT full visibility, control, and compliance readiness on all data sitting on corporate endpoints. We have customers more than 3,000 across 70 countries and 15 industries. The biggest concern we hear is lack of visibility into data that's sitting on corporate endpoints. We have 28% of corporate data now exclusively getting created and generated on corporate endpoints. And this data never comes inside the data center. And that's a big concern for our corporate customers. The second big concern has to do with information governance. Gartner says that by the year 2016, 20% of CIOs are going to lose their jobs if they do not implement information governance. The big driver for that is the duty to preserve data, mainly electronic data, sitting on these corporate endpoints for ongoing litigation or potential litigation that might happen down the road. And when you think about the duty to preserve data for potential litigation, then you begin to wonder, what data should I be preserving? Where does it reside? Again, going back to the visibility. And how do I capture it and preserve it? Today's capture processes and preservation processes are highly manual, labor-intensive, very expensive. Our customers come to us sharing stories about spending millions of dollars just capturing data and preserving it. As a result, corporations are finding themselves in a constant legal squeeze, inability to respond to potential litigation requests, and being able to serve these requests in a cost-effective manner. Shire Pharmaceutical. Shire is a global biopharma company specializing in the treatment of life-altering conditions like ADHD. They have more than 6,000 employees spread across the globe. Shire came to us with two main problems to solve. The first one had to do with the volume of research data on thousands of endpoint devices that was left unprotected and exposed to data breach, which meant millions and millions of dollars were at stake. The second issue had to do with Shire's manual, labor-intensive, and expensive process to respond to litigation requests. It would take them 4 to 5 days to locate any file on any endpoint device, and then weeks to months to capture it and make it available for e-discovery. This, of course, was getting unsustainable for Shire. They do a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and as more endpoints and more research data gets added to the mix, it meant the problem was compounding. Druva solved it for Shire, specifically around 4 solutions. We put in place the industry's best backup solution, and this was deployed to thousands and thousands of endpoints across the globe without any impact to employee productivity at all. And for data loss prevention, we made sure all the data, the research data sitting on endpoints was encrypted and could be remotely wiped should the device be lost or stolen. And this gave a lot of peace of mind to Shire. Now Shire has an end-to-end legal hold workflow for e-discovery enablement, which means what took them several weeks or months to respond to a single request now takes a matter of seconds or minutes. And security was a big concern for Shire, so we made sure all the data stored on the cloud was secure with two-factor encryption, offered the industry's highest levels of certification with ISAE, EU Safe Harbor, HIPAA certifications, and such. At Druva, we find customers come to us all the time wanting us to solve additional problems that we didn't foresee. And the good news is we are able to solve all of them using our flexible technology. I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first one has to do with device refresh, like the recent XP migration to Windows 8, where thousands and thousands of endpoint devices had to be refreshed to support the new OS. And we were able to solve it with persona backup, which backed up your system and application settings in addition to your data, to the point where employees could just log in into the new device on a Friday evening, and come Monday morning, they're good to go, fully productive. The second example has to do with expanded data capture for litigation requests. Customers came to us wanting us to capture additional sets of metadata that solved for better legal admissibility and for the specific use cases. And we were able to solve it for them. The third interesting trend that led customers come to us was mobile governance. This has to do with putting in access restrictions on your employees' mobile usage. Things like geofencing, where an employee access can be restricted based on where they're accessing the data from. And us being able to whitelist and blacklist other applications that can access the data with tighter integration with their existing MDM solutions. We see 3 major emerging trends in how customers are going to be evaluating solutions for data governance and protection. The first interesting trend we see is around intelligent data governance, specifically around file classification and how to leverage your existing file classification engines and the metadata it creates, and ensuring solutions like Druva leverage those metadata and control where data is stored, how employees can share that data with peers and colleagues, both internally and externally, and how that same metadata can be used for data governance, especially around capture of that data in a legal hold. The second major trend we see is around how customers are broadening their scope from endpoint data to data at the edge. And when they think about data at the edge, they think about two things. One is critical corporate data sitting in remote offices and branch offices. The second is critical corporate data that sits in the cloud already within Salesforce or Google Docs that your employees use constantly. And how do you apply data governance to those sets of data? And the third trend we see is the increasing role of security in the buying process, especially when countries like EMEA and APAC are playing a bigger role in the buying process with more stringent data location laws, data processing laws, EU Safe Harbor, advanced security and privacy considerations.